And in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Then God said, "Let there be a film."
It was very challenging for me to find people who would believe in me as a young director. But yet at the same time, since my late teenage years, you know, I was studying film theory and criticism for a very long time, and I knew that I wanted to make films and I don't want to do anything else. So things started to happen while I was making this film, and this was supposed to be a short film project, you know. I had this other script that I'd written prior to the making of the short film that I was working on, and it had a film within a film language.
Speaking of language, do you want this to be bilingual or just English, whichever you prefer?
Is there anybody here who doesn't speak Farsi?
All right, that's perfect.
Okay, so we have some people who don't speak Farsi. Okay, so we can continue in English, that's fine. Cinema, filmmaking, counter cinema, and a cinema that was kind of anti-ideological. So in those terms, the film was a film within a film about the making of a film inside of somebody's writing. Creativity, creation, and the creator, they go hand in hand in the artistic creative process, you know. And I think that like without that creative spark or that creative element inside of this film, you know, we have no art, you know. And it's not a religious film, but there is a religious theme inside of the film. But the language of the film is not religious. It's a very anti-ideological language. There's a lot of deconstruction of the author himself, you know. All these characters are an extension of his subconscious, you know. And basically, it was an experiment with form and structure in the first place.
Speaking of the form, you have such great admiration for symmetry, and all your symmetric forms is when it happens with the human angst is happening, as if it is a parallel between like a double of the individual that is the cause of that angst. All those symmetries were full of angst. Tell us about that.
Well, that's very true. On the other hand, you've got to remember, other than the form of the film, it's a film about these exiled characters. The film has an accent, you know. So the form of the film has that accent too, you know. But truthfully speaking, it's just not an experimental film when it comes to its form, but when it comes to its themes, because it's the exiled Iranians who are in between these two different identities and nationalities, you know. But yet, I've turned them into these aliens. They're neither from Iran, they're neither from here, they're in between East and West. And the language of the film and the form of the film is in between documentary and dramatic filmmaking, where I attack myself, creating an ideology, creating a film, and I deconstruct the author himself, telling you that just because I tell you something is real, it doesn't mean that it's real. It could be a lie or an illusion.
So the good thing that you mentioned about this structure, the writing of it, but at some point, take us to the point that where you're no longer writing, you're read. You're read by one of the, tell us.
That's true. Well, I don't want the male character to continue writing the whole film and be dominant there. The whole point was that he himself is a part of that writing. So that writer himself is a part of that script. We think it is him writing all these characters, but at the end of the film, it's the woman character. It's the actress. It's the mother symbol that reads his crucifixion, perhaps, to some extent, and I've kind of symbolized them as the director as this messianic figure, you know, because a lot of directors have dealt with religious themes sometimes. It's very interesting. Like Martin Scorsese wanted to become a priest, and then he went into films. They see something very sacred in the language of cinema. It's a blending of various arts and sciences, you know.
Perhaps that's the psychic element of it, because Jung also mentioned something, that the achievement of the cinema as an art form in our postmodern condition has always been that it makes you see what you don't want to do and you don't want, but you have to know it. It's like as if it opens the gateway to the subconscious in a way that it doesn't frighten you because you're not doing it.
That's true, and it's about identification process. That's the other thing. We all watch films and we try and identify with the character, you know. We want to become that hero. We want to become that lover. We want to see what it's like to be that character. But what if we get involved with not just seeing that character, but also the making of that character, you know? So there's a lot of spacing techniques. There's a lot of distancing, you know, that is involved with the film. I don't want you to completely identify with the characters and the stories. I am questioning the character and the story.
You actually did at the point that very dramatically one of your characters bangs the time, and then suddenly you create this split at the ground of being, which is the temporal unit is disturbed, and suddenly that nowhere, that the exile, it just come up again.
That's true, and I dealt with a lot. At the time when I was making this film, I was very much involved with studying three other things. That was religion, philosophy, and mysticism. And I applied and I incorporated some of those elements based on the language of cinema. The inner light turns into the light of the filmmaker, the light of God. The camera turns into a third eye, into an all-seeing God, you know. And then I create this sort of trinity where writer, director, actor, the mother figure, the father figure, and the director, you know. And the director becoming this messianic figure where he is being crucified for his art.
But you actually delve into it deeply in one of the dialogues in the movie when you say that you're not my father, you're my dad. You kind
because his father is God. Because his father is the invisible, formless one that you don't see. And that's the main author behind this film. That writer is not the writer of this film. He's trapped in that writing. You know?
You no longer give the subjectivity just to the camera, you actually stare back at it. It's a frightening Nietzschean experience that you look back at the camera is no longer the all-knowing eye. Tell us.
It's involving the camera in the film itself, you know. At some point I point to the camera and I say, I can't lose the camera. There's a reason why I keep emphasizing on the making of the film itself. I was working on creating an author character, and I saw a lot of other independent filmmakers struggling with poverty, and yet they were creative, and they felt like they were somebody. And I wanted to create this character that he thinks he's somebody, and nobody believes in him.
Do we have questions? There are questions.
When did you first become aware of the parallels between God and film, and then when did you begin to write about it?
Well, that was more than a decade ago, because I went through some sort of an awakening experience myself. And I never talked about these things to the Iranian community. I've been basically studying religion for a very long time, you know. Since the Iranian Revolution happened, a lot of people turned very much anti-spiritual. And they completely disregard what is behind religious texts, mystical texts, like spirituality, and you know, some of the great ancient writings that are out there that affected the language of religion, literature, poetry, and arts, you know. But I grew up in a very non-religious family myself, and it gave me a lot of freedom to think for myself and just try and experience for myself and research for myself. I consider myself a researcher, you know, not just a filmmaker. I continually have to research different things in order to make films about them sometimes, you know, whether it's a documentary film or a fiction film. So I became aware of this spirit behind creation every time that I was writing, every time that I was filming.
Shall we take another question? There's a question.
You mentioned a few things. But
I mentioned what? I'm sorry.
a few themes in the film.
Yes.
But one thing that you didn't mention is violence against men, and I think that exists in the film.
It's very interesting about her character because she wants to come and act in the film. When she starts acting in the film, she starts shooting what we've already seen before in the film. And in that scene, I symbolize her, the cuts that the guy is cutting. He says, cut, cut, and then he says, these cuts, they're the wounds within us. So, but you're right about saying that all these characters are very much wounded. The guy sitting in the basement, I turn him into this military guy who is wounded.
Actually, we see the band.
Yeah, and then that itself is very symbolic too because he holds his rib. And I think that I kind of, without like being too direct about those things, I kind of indirectly keep mentioning those wounds in the film. The wound of the filmmaker, the cut is symbolized as a wound.
Well, this Abrahamic religious theology and mostly Christianity is obviously all over the sky. But what I felt absolutely mostly toward the ending shot, to be more specific, but also during the film, was this being stuck and being shot in the cycle of life, which is more vague to me, samsara. So I was wondering to what extent were you also focusing on that part of the world's theology, particularly Indian?
Particularly India?
Yeah, the Vedic.
Oh, the Vedic, okay.
Samsara, the sun.
Okay. Well, you're absolutely right in saying that. You have to remember, for me, first of all, the New Testament is a book based on the Old Testament. This film is a film based on another film. The language of the film deals with biblical elements. I have incorporated some of those elements into the film. Many other people that know the Christian text, they don't know that it's rooted absolutely and 100% in the Torah and the Old Testament. And what happens is this. You give me a sentence about something, and I say that that sentence happened right there, and I'm going to write about it. They just see the outer structure. They don't see the inner structure and what is behind it. And there's a lot of actually Indian mysticism inside of the film too. I talk about Kundalini in the film. I don't know if many of you are aware of what it is, but it's a form of yoga. It's based on liberation. It's about adjustment. It's about balance of the feminine and the masculine within you. And then at the end of the film, you're right. If you look at the New Testament at the end, on the cross, the character says, God, why have you forsaken me? At the end, this guy says, God, get us out of this writing, as if we are trapped inside of this writing, inside of this film, and we are suffering in this dualistic world. You have to remember, in monotheistic religions, we have the light and the dark, and we have a formless God. It's very interesting.
Abstract, yes.
So you can't see that God, you know, but yet there is a source that this word originates from. It comes from absolute nothingness, you know. And the film kind of brings those elements and deals with these things. But you're right, if I were to show this film, it doesn't just have Christian elements, it has a lot of actually more Judaic elements. I start the film with the Torah, says in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, but then I change it, I say, as if the Word, you know, turns into a frame, you know. So,
and then you also ask for liberation from the word itself.
Liberation from this script, as if we are set up inside this script, bound to time. That's why he breaks the clock at the end too. So we're bound to time, and throughout the interaction between this light and darkness, conflict is created, somebody's attacked, somebody feels grief, somebody feels anger, you know, somebody might feel love or being a prophet even, you know. All these things kind of take the biblical language but use it in a different way and apply it towards the language of cinema instead.
I'm very glad that you mentioned the beginning of the film because it suddenly struck me at the beginning. And I was thinking that, okay, so there are two narratives in the Bible and the Genesis of the world.
Yes.
The most famous in the beginning, there was word, and the second in the beginning, there was void.
Yes.
And on the very beginning, point to the void one directly in the film, I was hearing you when you were saying that I was making a film with no crew, no cast, no money, nothing. It's as if you're creating the film based on void.
I actually kind of mentioned the void indirectly in there. There's a dialogue where I'm in the room and I'm talking and it says, it talks about actually the biblical language, and it says it's a book within a book. That's why I like the language. And then it jumps to something saying that it represents the primordial mound, where the creation arose out of nothingness.
More questions come.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, you said that you made this film 10 years ago.
Yes, a great part of this film was shot about 12, 13 years ago, actually, yes.
Okay, so what I'm wondering is, like in the movie, you said that people in Toronto, they're very like, they don't want to look you in the eye, they're very, you know, they mind their own business, they don't, they're just very cold, the attitude here is very
Yes.
cold. Do you feel that it's still the same way 10 years after?
I feel it's very typical of most of the North American cities, you know, where I saw a lot of people, including my friends who were struggling in Toronto, being very lonely. A lot of people come to me still complaining, saying that nobody pays attention to me, nobody says hi to me, nobody looks me in the eye, nobody has time for me. It's all about work and, you know, trying to make money or, you know, pay their bills. So the film doesn't, the film kind of indirectly or even maybe directly sometimes criticizes Iran and why we ended up being exiled, but on the other hand, it kind of criticizes the coldness that exists in some of the North American cities, especially the big cities, you know, where it's about work, it's about money, it's about getting ahead. And a lot of the immigrants that I saw settling here, you know, many of them didn't complain about money, they complained about not having love. They complained about not having friends. They complained about nobody paying any attention to them, you know. And we come from somewhat from the Eastern culture, and in the Middle East, everybody talks to you, everybody pays attention, you know. Everybody wants to know what you're doing. But it's not like that in here, and I kind of was showing these characters being very alienated as well. So
When you feel the cold, you feel something.
no, it's not that. Toronto is one of the friendliest cities.
I agree with you.
But in the film, I'm kind of showing these exiled characters where they're by themselves, they're lonely, and obviously they feel that coldness, and you do feel it sometimes.
And also for the drama, you do go to that dramatic exaggeration, but at the same time, you do have a point, because to look into somebody's eyes is to invite them, their soul into your soul. This is a dialogue beyond words, and that's frightening. More questions? There's a question.
So I'm 3 questions behind. You said that you clarified that it's not an anti-theological film, but it's anti-ideological in its form. So that clarity was helpful, except for I don't know what anti-ideological in its form means.
Okay, that's a very good question. Well, it goes back to the language of cinema and the form behind the narrative in cinema. When I tell you a story, the way that I tell you the story is whether I dictate the story to you or I give it to you in a form that I deconstruct the story and show you how the story itself was created in the first place. This film is about the making of a film, and it's a film within a film. So it's also about how an ideology is produced by this author. He might think there is a God. He might have an ideology coming out of that. He might think that he is this figure. He might have an ideology coming out of it.
Or he might have known that he knows the ending before it's end.
That's true. But then I kind of play around with that, and I turn this into, we call it anti-ideological cinema sometimes. It's also called counter-cinema, where you go against how an ideology is created in its form by a different language. And that's what I meant by political cinema too. Because we see some of these political or social films right now coming out of many different countries, and a lot of film festivals love these films, and they think that these are political films. But again, their forms have the same authoritarian form that comes from these authorities that they hate. It's because they didn't play around with the formal elements, or they didn't experiment, or maybe they didn't have the knowledge to do this, you know? But this film is against how an ideology is created in this film.
I see a hand way at the end, and then we'll go back to Gian. Yes, go ahead, Ben. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm going to put you in maybe a difficult position to answer this question. So how would you basically distinguish and differentiate spirituality from ideology and like religious, especially to someone as hardcore atheist as me? Like, how would you define it in one sentence? What is the difference between spirituality and ideology, and theology, religion?
Spirituality is not based on one text or one religion or one religious institution or any ideology. It's about seeking the truth from within yourself by finding out who you are. And it's an ongoing process to me. It never stops. When you have a religious text or a religious institution, they give you something and you obey those rules.
It goes back to the difference between spirituality and dogmas of religion, because spirituality is about going through an experience.
That's
it's a
right.
passing through the light, basically going out of the darkness to the light, by the will of the conscious, not by some kind of a fearful
Interesting enough,
experience.
a lot of people who think that they're not spiritual are very spiritual because they never believed in any ideology, so they kept those doors open to spirituality, you know? And they might know that they're more religious right now than some of the people who follow institutionalized religions, you know? And again, for the artists, especially for the artists, I keep emphasizing here that independent filmmaking is a holy process, you know? So again, that creative force and creation, I turned it into a prayer here, a cinematic prayer, basically.
Is there some final word, or we
Well,
just over the clock? Yeah.
We have a culture that condemns the younger generation. Like, we have this patriarchal, masculine culture that is sickening. And we talk about the authorities or our political problems in Iran.
Yeah.
You know, it goes back to every single one of us. And I think that, like, for instance, I don't know if Mr. Zeri is here. Is Mr. Zeri here?
I don't think so.
Okay. So that's the thing. Like we don't even see some of the people who were in the film. Why aren't they here? You know, what is wrong with you people? And as somebody who works in arts, I have no obligation to be watchful of my attitude. Again, when I show this film to the Iranian community, I noticed that they're connecting with the film right now. We had the same thing at the TIFF experience, you know. So they connect so much with the film, and it's a project that comes out of their own exiled community. You don't have that many independent films coming out. We have all these great builders here, and just imagine, like, they have invested millions and millions in building, you know. But when I started making films like 12, 13 years ago, I tried to get myself some funds. Nobody would sponsor, nobody would invest a dime on the younger generation or their art, you know? And it's not just art, it's a social act.
Well, it is so nice to feel like the honest expression of a struggling artist that is dealing with social issues and the struggles of... But thank you so much for attending. I appreciate all your questions.
God, get us out of this writing. Get us out of this play. Get us out, get us out, get us out, get us out, get us out.